He invented the science of boxing, but the system treated him like livestock. George Dixon, the first black world champion, generated a fortune for the white syndicates. His reward? A financial cage, a pulverized brain, and a death on the cold pavement. The promoters didn't just steal his money, they literally sold his concussions to the gambling mob. When his reflexes died, his own manager bet against him, watched him get beaten into neurological collapse, and threw him in the trash. George Dixon was born on July 29, 1870, in Africville, a segregated settlement on the edge of Halifax, Nova Scotia. He grew up in the dirt. His parents, Charles and Maria, had 8 mouths to feed. Dixon spent his early childhood in a state of constant physical deprivation. Hunger was his baseline. There was no safety net. In 1878, the lack of food and resources forced the family of 8 to leave Africville. They migrated south to Boston, Massachusetts. Dixon was 8 years old. He was thrown immediately into the workforce. By the age of 14, Dixon was working the streets of Boston as an errand boy. He carried packages. He navigated the alleys. He developed a high tolerance for exhaustion. He eventually secured a job at Elmer Chickering's photography studio on West Street. Chickering shot portraits for local athletes and fighters. Dixon was assigned to operate the camera. This was Dixon's introduction to the fight business. He stood behind the wooden camera boxes and watched professional fighters step under the lights. He adjusted the lenses. He posed them. He did not just look at them. He analyzed their biomechanics. He studied how they distributed their weight. He noted their muscle structure and their posture. He recognized the physical flaws in the men he was photographing. Dixon processed the violence of boxing as a mechanical equation. Years later, he wrote about this exact period. He stated that one day he simply threw the camera aside, walked out of the studio, and went to a boxing gym. He had seen enough. He knew he could execute the movements better than the men paying for portraits. In 1886, Dixon stepped into the professional ring. He was 16 years old. His physical dimensions were highly unusual. He stood 5 feet 3 inches tall. He weighed exactly 87 pounds. His reach was 66 inches. He looked like a fragile target. Opponents assumed they could break him in half. They were wrong. Dixon weaponized his anatomy. He did not fight with wild street brawl aggression. He fought with calculating, cold precision. His reaction time was completely abnormal. He possessed a neurological advantage. He could read the kinetic shifts in an opponent's shoulders before a punch was ever launched. Because he lacked the mass to absorb heavy damage, he engineered a defensive style based on pure evasion and sharp snapping counterstrikes. He hit hard, and he did not waste movement. He fought strictly to survive and advance. He started knocking out men who were older, heavier, and more experienced. His winning streak in the Boston circuit attracted immediate attention. A 16-year-old kid destroying veterans was a highly bankable commodity. Tom O'Rourke, a white manager and a seasoned operator in the local fight racket, noticed him immediately. O'Rourke did not evaluate Dixon as a human being. He evaluated him as a high-yield asset. O'Rourke saw a prodigy with terrifying speed. He also saw a young, uneducated black teenager with zero financial literacy, no legal representation, and a desperate need for cash. O'Rourke moved in to acquire him. The standard managerial contract was not enough. Fighters broke contracts. Fighters demanded audits. O'Rourke needed an ironclad mechanism to ensure Dixon could never leave his stable and could never question the money. In August 1889, O'Rourke executed a psychological and legal trap. He orchestrated a marriage between the 19-year-old George Dixon and his own sister Catherine Kitty O'Rourke. This was not a standard union. It was a binding contract disguised as a marriage. By marrying Kitty, Dixon was immediately severed from his family and his roots. O'Rourke uprooted the teenager and moved the couple into a residence in Beacon Hill. This was an exclusive, entirely white upper-class neighborhood. Dixon was completely isolated. The black community that would have naturally protected a young fighter was locked out. Dixon was surrounded exclusively by O'Rourke's network of promoters, gamblers, and handlers. The marriage served its exact operational purpose. Kitty O'Rourke was terrified of the boxing industry. She hated the physical violence her husband endured. She confessed to the press that she constantly fought the urge to stand up in the arenas and scream for him to stop fighting. This domestic anxiety wore Dixon down. It kept him off balance and mentally exhausted before he even stepped into the ring. He had no sanctuary. His home was an extension of his manager's control, with Dixon isolated in an unwelcoming neighborhood and anchored to a distressed wife. Tom O'Rourke seized total control. He became the sole signatory on all of Dixon's bout agreements. He controlled the purse money. He controlled the training schedules. He controlled the opponents. Dixon was technically a free man, but he was trapped in a financial and domestic cage engineered by his manager. O'Rourke had successfully secured absolute ownership of the most valuable young asset in boxing. The trap was set. Now O'Rourke prepared to put the machine to work. In 1890, the weight classes in professional boxing were not standardized by global commissions. They were manipulated by promoters to serve their financial interests. Dixon naturally walked around at under 100 pounds. The existing bantamweight limit hovered roughly between 112 and 116 pounds. O'Rourke refused to put his fighter at a marketable disadvantage. He did not wait for the boxing establishment to accommodate Dixon. He simply invented a new weight class. O'Rourke named it the paperweight division. He capped the strict limit at exactly 110 pounds. This was a calculated business move. By fabricating a world title out of thin air, O'Rourke created an instant championship narrative. He could market Dixon as the legitimate paperweight champion of the world. A title fight generates higher gate receipts. It attracts heavier betting volume. It draws the attention of the syndicates. O'Rourke bypassed the American local circuits entirely for this debut. He looked across the Atlantic. He recognized that the British upper class possessed massive gambling syndicates and a morbid curiosity for American fighters. In June 1890, O'Rourke shipped George Dixon to London. The target was Nunk Wallace, the reigning bantamweight champion of England. Wallace was a seasoned, naturally heavier fighter. He was backed by British money. The bout took place on June 27, 1890, inside the New Pelican Club Gym in London. This was not a public arena. It was an exclusive, closed-door establishment catering directly to British aristocrats, wealthy industrialists, and high-stakes gamblers. The men smoking cigars at ringside were betting thousands of pounds on the physical destruction of the men inside the ropes. Dixon weighed in at 113 pounds. He was fighting above his natural weight. He was a 19-year-old black kid from the slums of Halifax, standing in front of the British elite, fighting their national champion. The fight rules of the 1890s were brutal. Bouts did not have a set limit of 10 or 12 rounds. They were finish fights. You fought until a man was knocked unconscious or his corner threw in the towel. There were no neutral corners. There were no mandatory 8 counts. If a fighter went down, the opponent stood directly over him, waiting to strike the instant his knees left the canvas. Dixon dismantled Wallace systematically. He used his lateral movement to negate Wallace's size advantage. He targeted the liver and the solar plexus to drain the British champion's oxygen. The fight dragged deep into the afternoon. By the 18th round, Wallace was physically broken. Dixon delivered the final sequence, knocking Wallace out completely. On that day, George Dixon became the first black athlete in history to win a world championship in any major sport. The British press was stunned. The gamblers paid out their markers. O'Rourke collected the massive winner-take-all purse and the side bets. Dixon was handed a fraction of the payout. He returned to the United States not as a hero, but as a fully validated cash crop. O'Rourke immediately increased the production schedule. Winning a world title in the modern era guarantees a fighter a period of rest. In 1890, it simply meant the price of your blood had gone up. O'Rourke began booking Dixon in marathon fights that pushed the absolute limits of human physiology. On October 23, 1890, O'Rourke booked Dixon against Johnny Murphy in Providence, Rhode Island. This was not a standard title defense. It was an endurance test designed to extract maximum ticket sales. The fight lasted 40 rounds. To understand a 40-round fight, you must strip away the modern concept of sports medicine. In 1890, there were no ringside physicians enforcing safety protocols. There was no intravenous hydration between rounds. Fighters consumed whiskey or warm water mixed with brandy in the corner. By round 20, a fighter's kidneys begin to shut down from severe dehydration and repetitive blunt force trauma to the lower back. Lactic acid crystallizes in the muscles. The cartilage in the hands shatters. The brain swells against the skull from the constant subconcussive impacts. Dixon survived the 40 rounds and broke Murphy down, but the physical cost was permanent. O'Rourke did not care. The gate receipts cleared, and he needed the next weight. 2 months later, the exploitation escalated to a near-fatal level. O'Rourke signed Dixon to fight Cal McCarthy in Boston. McCarthy was a veteran brawler known for high pain tolerance. O'Rourke agreed to terms that bordered on attempted murder. The fight was scheduled as a marathon bout using 2-ounce gloves. Modern boxing gloves weigh between 8 and 10 ounces. They contain dense foam designed to protect the fighter's hands and disperse the kinetic energy of a strike. 2-ounce gloves were nothing but tightly stitched, unpadded leather sheaths. They offered zero protection. A punch thrown with a 2-ounce glove delivers the exact mechanical force of a bare-knuckle strike. It drives the knuckles directly into the facial bones. It causes massive lacerations. It fractures orbitals and shatters jaws. Dixon and McCarthy fought for 70 rounds. It was a systematic physical execution. For 70 rounds, the two men battered each other with skin-tight leather. The fight lasted over 4 hours. The canvas was soaked in blood. Both men suffered severe concussions, structural bone damage to their hands, and massive facial trauma. The bout was not stopped by a doctor. It was declared a draw only because both men physically could not stand up from their stools to answer the bell. They were entirely drained of blood and adrenaline. The gambling syndicates took their cuts from the draw. O'Rourke secured his managerial percentage of the ticket sales. Dixon received the physical trauma. He was given no time to heal. The structural damage to his hands was ignored. The concussive symptoms, the ringing in the ears, the sensitivity to light, the chronic headaches, were dismissed as the normal cost of doing business. O'Rourke saw that McCarthy was still a viable draw. The 70-round massacre had generated massive local press coverage. The public wanted a definitive conclusion. O'Rourke immediately negotiated a rematch. On March 31, 1891, Dixon was pushed back into the ring against McCarthy. His body was still compromised from the previous 70-round fight, but Dixon's tactical intellect took over. He realized he could not survive another war of attrition. He changed his mechanics. He fought strictly on the outside, using snapping jabs to reopen McCarthy's scar tissue. He let McCarthy exhaust himself trying to force a brawl. In the 22nd round, Dixon found the opening and stopped McCarthy via technical knockout. Dixon secured the undisputed bantamweight championship. He held 2 world titles before his 21st birthday. He had survived 150 rounds of professional unpadded combat in the span of less than a year. To the public, George Dixon was a dominant, wealthy champion. Behind closed doors, the reality was clinical and bleak. O'Rourke held all the contracts. The money generated from the Wallace, Murphy, and McCarthy fights went directly into O'Rourke's bank accounts. Dixon was kept on a strict allowance. He was isolated in Beacon Hill with Kitty. He was physically deteriorating. The syndicates demanded more fights, and O'Rourke had every intention of feeding his fighter back into the machine. The relentless schedule, orchestrated by Tom O'Rourke, created an immediate logistical problem. Dixon was essentially living on the railroad system. He moved constantly between New York, Boston, Providence, and smaller industrial towns. A world champion requires a stationary training camp. A champion requires paid sparring partners to maintain distance management and timing. O'Rourke refused to finance either. He viewed sparring partners as a drain on the profit margin. He viewed training camps as unnecessary overhead. Dixon was isolated on the road. He had no one to train with. He was forced to solve the problem of physical maintenance entirely alone. He locked himself in empty gymnasiums and hotel rooms. He began to simulate combat. He visualized an opponent standing in front of him. He slipped punches that were not thrown. He pivoted out of corners that did not exist. He threw combinations into the open air, focusing on his balance and the kinetic snap of his hips. He called it shadow boxing. Today, this practice is the absolute foundation of all combat sports. Every fighter on the planet shadow boxes. In 1891, it was viewed as an eccentric, bizarre behavior. Dixon did not stop at shadowboxing. The marathon fights were draining his stamina. He needed resistance training. He took heavy canvas sacks, filled them with dense sand or tightly packed rags, and suspended them from the ceiling with iron chains. This was the first iteration of the modern heavy bag. He needed to accelerate his hand-eye coordination to deal with heavier fighters. He bolted a wooden platform to the floor and attached a small inflated leather ball on a swivel. He created the speed bag to build shoulder endurance for fights that regularly exceeded 40 rounds. He shadowboxed while gripping small iron dumbbells. Dixon was not just a fighter, he was a biomechanical engineer. He codified his methods. In 1893, he authored an instructional manual titled A Lesson on Boxing. He broke down the geometry of footwork. He explained the exact leverage required for a counterpunch. He detailed how to cut off the ring. He proved on paper that he was an intellectual tactician. The sporting press of the 1890s was exclusively white. They controlled the historical record. They watched a 20-year-old black man invent the modern science of boxing, and they actively refused to credit him. Newspaper columnists and boxing historians systematically erased his name from the blueprint. They attributed his inventions to the natural evolution of the sport. They claimed the heavy bag and the speed bag were collective industry advancements. They stole his intellectual property because admitting that a black teenager possessed a superior tactical mind directly threatened the racial hierarchy of the era. By 1892, Dixon's body was maturing. He could no longer drain himself to meet O'Rourke's fabricated 110-pound limit. He moved up to the featherweight division. On June 27, 1892, he fought Fred Johnson at Coney Island, New York. Dixon knocked Johnson out in the 14th round. He captured his second undisputed world title. 3 months later, the system fought back. The Olympic Club in New Orleans organized a massive 3-day boxing festival in September 1892. It was billed as the Carnival of Champions. The entire sports world focused on New Orleans. On September 6th, Dixon was booked to defend his title against Jack Skelly. Skelly was a white fighter. The racial tension in the Deep South was critical. The local white establishment viewed the bout as a demonstration of racial superiority. They expected Skelly to destroy Dixon. Dixon dismantled him completely. He battered Skelly from the opening bell. He shattered Skelly's nose. He dropped him multiple times. In the 8th round, Dixon delivered a final combination that knocked Skelly unconscious. The crowd erupted in fury. A black man destroying a white challenger in Louisiana was not viewed as a sporting event. It was viewed as an insurrection. The organizers at the Olympic Club panicked. They immediately issued a public declaration banning all future interracial fights at their venue. This was the beginning of the color line in boxing. The Jim Crow laws that governed the southern streets were now violently enforced inside the ropes. Promoters across the country followed the Olympic Club's lead. White champions refused to sign contracts against black contenders. The highly lucrative mainstream title fights dried up instantly. Dixon was frozen out of the major arenas. Tom O'Rourke was holding an asset that suddenly had nowhere to fight. O'Rourke needed cash flow. He refused to let the political climate stop the machine. He pivoted his entire business model. If the established sporting world would not buy tickets to see George Dixon, the entertainment world, Wood O'Rourke, formed a traveling vaudeville act. He named it the George Dixon Specialty Company. From 1893 to 1896, O'Rourke dragged the featherweight champion of the world through the dirtiest, lowest circuits of American theater. They bypassed the major cities and hit the rural industrial routes. They stopped at places like the Naylor Opera House in Indiana. Dixon was stripped of his dignity as an elite athlete. He was reduced to a carnival attraction. Every night the routine was the same. Dixon would come out on stage and perform his shadow boxing routine. He would demonstrate his speed bag technique. Then O'Rourke would step to the front of the stage and offer a cash bounty to any man in the audience who could last 3 or 4 rounds with the champion. Dixon was forced to fight local thugs, aggressive factory workers, and drunken farmers every single night. These were not regulated bouts. There were no weight limits. Dixon weighed under 120 pounds. He was fighting men who outweighed him by 50 or 60 pounds. They did not know how to box. They only knew how to brawl, grab, and foul. Dixon fought thousands of unrecorded rounds on these stages. He survived by neutralizing the bigger men early, slipping their wild punches, and digging into their ribs. But the local referees were blatantly corrupt. If a white local managed to survive the round simply by holding on or running away, the referee would declare the bout a draw. Often they would declare the local man the winner to satisfy the aggressive crowds. The robbery was so obvious that even the heavily biased press had to acknowledge it. On September 30th, 1893, the National Police Gazette, a major true crime and sports publication, printed an article stating explicitly that Dixon was being robbed of clear victories entirely due to racial prejudice. O'Rourke did not care about the scorecards. He cared about the door. He collected the ticket revenue at every stop. He took his massive managerial cut and kept the syndicate bosses paid. Dixon absorbed the permanent physical toll. He was not training. He was merely surviving daily combat. The cartilage in his knuckles was breaking down. The ligaments in his shoulders were stretching out. His brain was absorbing repetitive, unrecorded trauma night after night in dusty opera houses across the Midwest. The machine was doing exactly what it was designed to do, extracting capital from the fighter's body until there was nothing left to extract. Dixon was systematically isolated, physically exhausted, and legally bound. Yet he refused to be completely neutralized. Off the stage and outside the ring, Dixon understood exactly what he represented. In the 1890s, he was one of the only globally recognized black men in the world who wielded actual cultural power. He adopted the mantle of a race man. He used his leverage. He openly addressed black civic leaders in Boston. He stated clearly that every time he stepped into the ring, he was not just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting to validate the existence of his entire race. He forced structural changes on the promoters. If a promoter wanted George Dixon on the card, they had to agree to his terms regarding the audience. Dixon routinely mandated that black ticket holders be given access to premium, ringside seating, rather than being forced into the segregated upper balcony rafters. He was aggressive with his capital. He poured thousands of dollars of his own fight purses into black orphanages. He bought winter coal for impoverished families in his old neighborhoods. He handed out cash on the street to anyone who asked. To the public, this was the mark of a generous king. To Tom O'Rourke, it was a highly exploitable character flaw. O'Rourke understood the psychology of financial control. A wealthy fighter has options. A wealthy fighter can afford legal counsel. A wealthy fighter can retire. Therefore, the fighter must never actually retain his wealth. O'Rourke and his syndicate actively encouraged Dixon's massive spending. They surrounded him with a permanent entourage of sycophants, gamblers, and hangers-on. When the entourage ordered expensive liquor, charged massive hotel bills, or demanded loans, O'Rourke ensured the tabs were pushed directly to Dixon's account. They constructed a psychological trap. They stroked Dixon's ego. They convinced him that spending aggressively was the only way to maintain his status as a champion of his people. O'Rourke allowed Dixon to throw his money away because it served the ultimate managerial goal, keeping the asset completely dependent. Over the course of his active career, George Dixon generated an estimated $250,000 in fight purses and theatrical tours. Adjusted for modern inflation, he was generating millions, yet his bank accounts were perpetually empty. He was trapped in a cycle of indentured servitude. Every time he went broke, he had to sign the next contract O'Rourke put in front of him. There was no leverage to negotiate terms. He fought simply to clear the debts his manager allowed him to accumulate. The volume of fights required to outpace this debt was staggering. Historical records indicate Dixon fought over 800 times. Most of these were off the record, unregulated bouts in smoky saloons, underground cellars, and dance halls. He fought multiple times a week. Human biology cannot sustain this level of kinetic trauma. The human skull is not designed to absorb thousands of concussive impacts. The cartilage in the knuckles, elbows, and shoulders inevitably grinds down to bone. By the late 1890s, the physical decay was undeniable. Dixon's primary weapon had always been his abnormal reaction time. That speed is entirely dependent on the central nervous system. After a decade of constant head trauma, his fast-twitch muscle fibers stopped firing. His reflexes degraded. He could no longer slip punches by a fraction of an inch. He began absorbing direct, heavy blows to the jaw and temple. O'Rourke saw the metrics dropping. He knew the asset was fully depreciated. Dixon was approaching 30 years old. In the brutal economy of 19th century boxing, 30 was ancient. O'Rourke recognized that Dixon's time as a champion was ending. Instead of protecting his fighter or preparing him for retirement, O'Rourke calculated one final massive extraction. He decided to sell Dixon out. The target was Terry McGovern. McGovern was a young, explosive, violently aggressive Irish-American fighter. He hit with devastating power. O'Rourke knew exactly what McGovern was. He also knew that the current compromised version of George Dixon could not survive a fight with him. O'Rourke did not try to avoid the matchup. He booked it. The fight was set for January 9, 1900, at the Broadway Athletic Club in New York City. The featherweight world title was on the line. The betting syndicates were heavily invested. Dixon was still a legendary name, which kept the odds tight enough to be profitable. Behind closed doors, O'Rourke made his move. He took his own money and the money of his immediate associates and placed massive, quiet bets on Terry McGovern to win. He bet directly against his own fighter. He bet against his own brother-in-law. When Dixon walked into the Broadway Athletic Club that night, his body was completely hollowed out. The fight was not a competition. It was a scheduled execution. McGovern swarmed him immediately. Dixon's legs were dead. His head movement was gone. McGovern landed heavy, crushing shots directly to Dixon's head. Dixon was knocked down. He dragged himself up. McGovern dropped him again. Standard boxing protocol demands that a manager protect his fighter's life. If a fighter is taking unnecessary fatal damage, the corner must throw a sponge or a towel into the ring to stop the bout. O'Rourke stood in the corner holding the towel and did absolutely nothing. He watched McGovern systematically destroy Dixon. Dixon was knocked down a total of 8 times. His brain bounced against his skull with every impact. He was bleeding heavily. He had 0 defensive capabilities left. Still, O'Rourke refused to intervene. He needed the knockout to be absolute to guarantee his betting slips paid out. He forced Dixon to absorb maximum life-altering brain trauma simply to maximize the return on investment. Finally, in the 8th round, the referee stepped in and waved the fight off. Dixon was broken. O'Rourke quietly collected his winnings from the illegal bookmakers. The championship was gone. The money was gone. The physical utility of George Dixon had been completely exhausted. January 10th, 1900, the morning after the Terry McGovern fight. George Dixon woke up in a hotel room in New York City with severe, acute brain swelling. He had been knocked down 8 times the previous night. His manager, Tom O'Rourke, was nowhere to be found. O'Rourke was busy cashing the illegal betting slips he had placed against his own fighter. The financial extraction was complete. The managerial contract that had bound Dixon since 1889 was quietly voided. There was no formal meeting. There was no severance package. The syndicate simply cut the cord. O'Rourke legally insulated himself, ensuring that when the creditors came for Dixon, the managerial accounts remained untouched. Dixon's financial collapse was instantaneous. The $250,000 he had generated over the previous decade did not exist in liquid assets. It existed as bar tabs, hotel bills, and undocumented loans that O'Rourke had allowed him to accumulate. Within days of losing the world title, the creditors moved in. Dixon's accounts were frozen. His possessions were liquidated. The massive entourage that had shadowed him for 10 years evaporated. The men who drank his whiskey and spent his money did not answer his calls. When the financial utility of George Dixon vanished, the media narrative violently shifted. For 10 years, the white press had tolerated Dixon because he was a highly profitable spectacle. Now that he was broke and brain damaged, they weaponized his ruin. The major newspapers in New York and Boston launched a coordinated character assassination. They did not investigate O'Rourke's predatory contracts. They did not investigate the medical negligence of the 70-round fights. Instead, they branded Dixon a race menace. They published aggressive editorials claiming his bankruptcy was biological. They wrote that a black man was naturally incapable of managing wealth. They used Dixon as a cautionary tale to argue for the permanent segregation of sports. They claimed that giving a black athlete access to money and status only resulted in degenerate spending and social decay. This was not sports journalism. It was systemic propaganda designed to reinforce the racial hierarchy of the 1900s. The propaganda worked flawlessly. It infiltrated the black middle class. In the early 20th century, black civic leaders were fighting a desperate battle for social respectability. They were trying to build political capital by projecting an image of flawless, educated, moral citizenship. George Dixon, a bankrupt, stuttering, alcoholic former prizefighter, was an extreme liability to that image. The community leaders who had once proudly invited Dixon to speak at their churches, the men who had accepted his massive donations to their orphanages, systematically turned their backs. They locked him out of their institutions. They refused to offer him legal counsel or financial shelter. Dixon was entirely ostracized. The establishment used him to prove white superiority, and his own community discarded him to protect their political standing. Dixon was 30 years old. He was socially isolated, entirely broke, and suffering from the advanced stages of dementia pugilistica. The repetitive blunt force trauma had permanently altered his brain chemistry. He developed a severe stutter. His hands shook with resting tremors. He could not walk in a straight line. But he was trapped in a financial vacuum. He only knew one method to generate cash. He had to keep fighting. The American promoters refused to book him. He was a recognized liability. So Dixon looked for a loophole. In 1903, he boarded a ship for London. He believed the British gambling syndicates would remember his 1890 knockout of Nunk Wallace. He believed his name still held equity overseas. He was walking into a secondary trap. When Dixon arrived in London, the British boxing establishment knew exactly what they were looking at. The promoters and the medical examiners saw a man with severe neurological decay. They saw the tremors. They heard the slurred speech. A legitimate athletic commission would have immediately revoked his license on medical grounds. The British board did the exact opposite. They approved his license. They did not license him because he was competitive. They licensed him because the name George Dixon still sold tickets to the lower-class British public. They recognized a highly exploitable dynamic. Local British fighters wanted the prestige of putting a former American world champion on their knockout records. From 1903 to 1905, Dixon was fed to young, heavy-hitting British prospects in cheap arenas across England. It was a clinical dismantling. Dixon was a stationary target. His defensive reflexes were entirely gone. He could not slip punches. He absorbed horrific flush impacts to the jaw and temple. He fought for pennies. He fought simply to buy food and cheap alcohol to numb the chronic migraines. The British promoters wrung the final drops of blood from his legacy. They booked him against men who were naturally larger, faster, and decades younger. They let the local fighters batter him into unconsciousness, collected the gate receipts, and handed Dixon enough cash to survive until the next beating. When he was entirely bled dry, when he could no longer physically stand up to answer a bell, the British circuit discarded him. In late 1905, George Dixon was sent back across the Atlantic. He arrived in the United States with nothing. No money, no management, no community. His brain was completely shattered. The exploitation phase of his life was officially over. The final phase was about to begin. By 1906, the American boxing syndicate had entirely erased George Dixon from their ledgers. He was no longer an asset. He was a ghost haunting the infrastructure he helped build. When Dixon returned to the United States from his disastrous British tour, he had no capital, no management, and no home. He migrated between the two cities that had once generated his immense wealth, Boston and New York. But he did not return to the Beacon Hill mansions or the high-end hotels. He returned to the pavement. Dixon became a vagrant. He slept in alleyways, beneath train trestles, and on the damp floors of boiler rooms. The physical toll of over 800 professional and unrecorded fights had reached its terminal phase. Dixon was in his mid-30s, but his biological age was unrecognizable. His joints were calcified. The cartilage in his hands and shoulders was completely ground away, but the most severe damage was neurological. He suffered from advanced dementia pugilistica. The repetitive subconcussive impacts had physically shrunk his frontal lobe. His motor functions misfired constantly. He walked with a staggered, heavy limp. He could not form coherent sentences without severe stuttering. With zero access to medical care or a social safety net, Dixon turned to the only anesthetic available on the street. He became heavily dependent on cheap alcohol. This was not a moral failing or a character flaw, as the press cynically claimed. It was desperate self-medication. He drank strictly to numb the chronic, blinding migraines and the constant physical agony radiating from his shattered bones. He spent his days gravitating toward the only environment he understood, the boxing gyms. Dixon became a fixture outside the training camps and athletic clubs on the East Coast. He stood near the service entrances in the freezing winters, holding his hand out, begging for spare change from the new generation of fighters, managers, and promoters walking through the doors. The industry response was absolute indifference. The men who now controlled the fight game looked right through him. They viewed him as a public nuisance. To the active fighters, Dixon was a terrifying reflection of their own inevitable future. To the promoters, he was a walking public relations disaster. They actively ignored him. They stepped around him. They refused to acknowledge that the broken man begging for nickels had laid the financial and tactical foundation for their entire sport. There was only one recorded exception, and it came with brutal irony. In 1907, a reporter witnessed Dixon attempting to panhandle outside a gym. A massive aging man approached and handed Dixon a dollar bill. That man was John L. Sullivan. Sullivan was the first heavyweight champion of the gloved era. He was also one of the most notoriously racist figures in American sports history. He had strictly enforced the color line, famously refusing to ever defend his title against a black challenger. Yet Sullivan was the only man in the American boxing hierarchy who consistently gave Dixon money on the street. This was not an act of progressive racial reconciliation. It was game recognizing game. Sullivan had also been chewed up by the promoters. He had also battled severe alcoholism. Sullivan looked at Dixon and saw the raw, unfiltered damage of the prize-fighting machine. He recognized that the syndicate had extracted Dixon's blood and left him to die. Dixon later told a reporter in one of his final lucid statements, "The men who followed me in the days of my glory now avoid me. John L. Sullivan is the only man who has never turned his back on me in my time of trouble." The human body can only sustain that level of systemic neglect for so long. The collapse came in the first week of 1908. Dixon was found unresponsive on the streets of New York City. He was loaded into a horse-drawn ambulance and transported to Bellevue Hospital. Bellevue was notorious for its indigent wards. It was the final stop for the city's poorest, most destitute citizens. There were no private doctors. There was no specialized care. The medical staff simply placed him in a bed and waited for his organs to fail. On January 6, 1908, George Dixon died. He was 37 years old. The official cause of death was listed as a combination of self-medication and physical exhaustion. The reality is that he died from a decade of untreated, promoter-sanctioned head trauma. He died completely bankrupt. He possessed nothing. His corpse was tagged and transferred to the city morgue. Because nobody stepped forward to claim the body or pay for a burial, the state prepared to dump his remains into a potter's field, an unmarked mass trench used for the homeless and forgotten. When the news hit the papers, the boxing establishment panicked. Having the first black world champion thrown into a garbage trench was bad for business. It pulled the curtain back on the reality of their industry. They needed to clean up the mess. The promoters and syndicate bosses, who had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from Dixon, suddenly mobilized. They did not do it out of respect. They did it for damage control. The New York boxing circuit hastily organized a charity boxing tournament. On January 23, 1908, they ran a local show. They scraped together just enough gate receipts to buy Dixon's corpse out of the city morgue. They shipped his body north and buried him at Mount Hope Cemetery in Boston. They put him in the dirt, patted themselves on the back, and went right back to promoting fights. The sanitization of George Dixon's legacy began decades later. The institutions that govern sports history eventually realized the value of his name. Nat Fleischer, the founder of Ring Magazine, retroactively declared him the greatest bantamweight in history. In 1990, the International Boxing Hall of Fame inducted him into their inaugural class. In 2021, the Canadian government erected a bronze plaque at the Africville Museum, officially designating him a National Historic Person. They sell a polished narrative. They praise his tactical genius. They celebrate his invention of shadowboxing. They frame his life as a triumph of athletic achievement against the odds. It is a comfortable lie. Bronze plaques and Hall of Fame rings do not rewrite the forensic evidence. They do not erase the 70-round bare-knuckle fights with 2-ounce gloves. They do not erase Tom O'Rourke's predatory contracts. They do not erase the stolen wages, the racial blacklisting, or the willful medical negligence that left a 30-year-old man with the brain of an Alzheimer's patient. George Dixon did not just participate in the sport of boxing. He engineered its modern science. He drew the operational blueprint that every fighter on the planet still uses today. In return, the capitalist machinery functioned exactly as it was designed to. It identified a highly profitable asset. It isolated him. It extracted every ounce of physical equity he possessed to satisfy the gambling syndicates. And when his brain was too damaged to generate another dollar, the system discarded the empty shell on the pavement. That is the true, unvarnished legacy of the fight game. The house always wins. The promoters always get rich. And the fighter always pays the absolute price.